Morning came as a whisper that could be held in two hands, fog braided around the old lighthouse until it looked like a candle wrapped in cloud. The world often begins with such gentle mysteries, and for Kieran, it began with a hum. Not quite. A heartbeat? Not quite a song, but something that pulsed between the two like a secret only the morning mist could keep. Henrik, the lighthouse keeper whose life had been 17 years of predictable solitude, stepped into that milk-white air and found the wicker basket tucked against the sea-worn stones. Inside lay an infant with sleep-damp hair and fingers that flickered with the faintest blue shimmer whenever he stirred. The light wasn't magic in any grand sense, no thunderclap or sudden miracle, only a gentle luminescence that pulsed in rhythm with the child's breathing. Like moonlight caught in glass, tucked beneath the swaddling cloth, a note offered the only explanation the world would provide. He hears what needs helping. Henrik read those words and nodded, as if a truth he'd already suspected had finally been written down. The keeper had learned to read storms by scent alone, and he could sense that this child carried weather of a different kind entirely. He named the infant Kieran that very hour, after a saint said to have listened to birds until the birds grew gentle. As Henrik cradled him, something shifted in the lighthouse keeper's chest. A recognition that his season of solitude was ending, replaced by something he couldn't yet name but somehow welcomed. The child rarely cried in the usual way. Instead, Kieran would emit a soft hum, barely audible, that seemed to resonate not in Henrik's ears but somewhere deeper, in the space between his ribs where worry lived. Even then, before language and choice, help was not something Kieran did. It was the way his presence shaped the air around him, an echo chamber for the world's unspoken needs. When Henrik carried him to the village square to be seen and blessed, in the simple ways of small places, the child's gift revealed itself in gentle increments. An old woman touched Kieran's wrist and admitted a pain she'd kept quiet for years. The blue shimmer brightened briefly, and while the pain didn't vanish, it softened like a knot loosening under warm water. A fisherman set down his nets and cried. For the first time since the accident, everyone pretended not to remember. The baby didn't wail at the noise. He breathed and watched, and that curious hum listened with him. It wasn't magic anyone recognized, only the way small burdens lightened. When the child was near, the way even the wind paused to hear itself. Henrik brought him back to the lighthouse and leaned a cradle near the window where night lifted and lowered like breath. Sometimes when the foghorn moaned, Kieran would reach into the air as if touching a thread only he could see, and in the houses scattered along the bluff, forgotten kettles were turned off, lost thoughts returned, whispers of comfort passed through rooms as lightly as the scent of toast. The hum in his chest grew stronger each day, tuning itself to the world's quiet. Desperation, every dropped worry, every moment of human struggle calling to him like bells only he could hear. Henrik watched and understood that this strange, luminous child would teach him new meanings of guidance, new ways of helping others find their way through darkness towards something that might, if they were very lucky, resemble peace. Seasons turned like pages in a well-loved book, and the boy who had arrived with the fog learned to walk among the lighthouse stones as if they were old friends. By his 5th spring, Kieran's presence had settled into the rhythm of Henrik's days like a second heartbeat, steady, gentle, necessary. The hum in his chest had grown stronger with each passing year, tuning itself to the world's quiet needs, like a compass needle finding true north. Henrik, now deeper into his 70s, moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to listen to his body's whispered warnings. On this particular morning, when late frost had nipped the tender shoots in their small garden behind the lighthouse, he worked with stubborn determination to save what remained of their vegetables. His back protested each bend, his breath came, shorter with each effort, but the plants needed tending, and Henrik had never been one to leave a task unfinished. Kieran played nearby, collecting smooth stones and arranging them in patterns only he understood, when he felt the shift in the air, that particular quality of distress that made the hum in his chest deepen and quicken. He looked up to see Henrik sink to one knee among the wilted lettuce, not unconscious but unable to rise, his weathered hands pressed against the earth for support. Without thought, without plan, Kieran pressed his small palms together and spoke, a word that seemed to arrive from somewhere beyond his 5 years of vocabulary. Help. The air shimmered like heat waves rising from summer stones, though the morning was cool and damp. Her figure materialized with the gentle suddenness of bubbles forming in still water, bright blue, roughly human-shaped, radiating an eager enthusiasm that felt both comforting and slightly overwhelming. Its eyes were wide with anticipation, its movements quick and purposeful. "I'm here to help," it said in a voice like wind chimes, and without waiting for instruction, it moved to Henrik's side. With gentle efficiency, it helped the old man to the shade of the lighthouse wall, brought water, fanned him with a broad leaf until color returned to his cheeks. The helper's touch was careful, its attention complete, and Henrik's breathing gradually steadied. Kieran felt relief wash through him like cool water, the hum in his chest settling back to its usual rhythm. But when Henrik was clearly recovered, sitting comfortably in the shade with grateful eyes, the blue helper didn't fade away. Instead, it turned its attention to the garden with renewed purpose. What followed was assistance so thorough it began to feel like something else entirely. The helper tended every plant with surgical precision, then moved to organize the tool shed, then began scrubbing the lighthouse windows until they gleamed like mirrors. When that was complete, it started digging what appeared to be a well in the center of their small yard, a well they neither needed nor wanted, but which the helper approached with the same boundless enthusiasm it had shown everything else. "It doesn't know when to stop," Henrik observed quietly, his voice carrying both wonder and gentle concern. He watched the helper's relentless efficiency with the patient eyes of someone who had learned to read weather patterns in the smallest changes of wind. Kieran stood and walked to the blue figure, placing his small hand on its arm. "Thank you," he said softly, the words carrying a weight of completion he was only beginning to understand. "That's enough now." The helper paused, its eager expression shifting to something like confusion, then relief. It bowed slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than ceremony, and dissolved back into the shimmering air that had birthed it. In the quiet that followed, Kieran learned his first lesson about the gift that hummed in his chest, that calling help was simple, but knowing, when help should end, required a different kind of wisdom entirely. The world's needs would always be endless, but endings, he was beginning to understand, were something he would have to learn to speak with his own voice. The well hole filled itself with autumn rain and patient time, and in the months that followed, Kieran learned that calling help was like opening a door, simple enough, but knowing when to close it again required a different kind of wisdom entirely. The hum in his chest grew with him, deepening from a child's whisper to something richer and more complex, like a bell that had learned new notes. By the time the lighthouse wore its coat of amber leaves, that gentle vibration had become a symphony of the world's unfinished business, each small frustration or sorrow finding its way to him like letters delivered by the wind. The calls came, as impressions carried on sea air, not voices exactly, but the particular weight of need that settled in his chest like stones. Mrs. Chen's arthritis spoke to him in the language of morning stiffness. The baker's burned loaves whispered their disappointment through the scent of smoke. Even a child's dropped ice cream cone on the village boardwalk sent ripples of sadness that reached him at the lighthouse, small as they were, clear as church bells in the distance. His Meeseeks friends, as he'd begun calling the blue helpers, with the fond exasperation of someone learning to love a gift that wouldn't stay simple, appeared more frequently now. They materialized with the same eager shimmer, their voices like wind chimes announcing, "I'm here to help," before setting about their tasks with an efficiency that was both wonderful and increasingly worrying. When the baker's oven failed during the evening rush, a Meeseeks fixed it within minutes, then reorganized the entire bakery, switching the labels on sugar and salt, leaving the poor man more bewildered than helped. Another time, summoned to untangle a child's stubborn kite string, a helper not only freed the kite, but proceeded to repair every piece of playground equipment in sight, accidentally dismantling a perfectly good swing in its enthusiasm to improve what was already whole. Kieran began to understand what Henrik meant when he said that some kindness creates space for new troubles to fill. Each solved problem sent ripples across the village like stones thrown into still water, and those ripples carried new needs, new calls that reached his increasingly sensitive awareness. The world's struggles, he was learning, were not a list to be completed, but a river that flowed endlessly, and his gift made him feel like the riverbed, absorbing every current of distress that passed through. At night, when the foghorn's low note rolled across the water, Kieran practiced a different kind of listening. He learned to sort the calls by their depth. Some were surface ripples, small frictions that life used to teach small lessons. Others ran deeper, like undertows that pull at the ankles, and those deserved his attention. He made a quiet game, half weighing each call like a seed in his palm. If the hum stayed light, he breathed and let it pass. If it throbbed with the particular ache of true need, he whispered help and watched the air turn blue. Henrik noticed the tiredness that gathered at the edges of the boy's brightness. Evening tea became a ritual of gentle untangling, steam rising like thoughts made visible. "You're not a bucket for every leak in the world," he would say, his weathered hand resting on Kieran's shoulder like an anchor. "You're a listener. Choose what you carry." In the spaces between the foghorn's call and the tide's answer, Kieran learned to sit with need without always answering it, offering silent witness to someone's unknown sorrow. Often the ache softened on its own, like a knot warming beneath patient hands. The world, he was beginning to understand, sometimes needed witnesses more than workers, but learning the difference between the two would take more practice than any 8-year-old should have to bear alone. The morning Mira arrived. The lighthouse felt different before she even stepped through the door, as if the walls themselves had shifted to make space for a different kind of listening. She came in Henrik's arms on a grey afternoon when the fog hung low enough to touch. A 3-year-old, with eyes that held the deep calm of forest pools, and a cloth rabbit whose ears had been loved into perfect softness. The social worker spoke gently about temporary placement, but Kieran felt something deeper, settling into place, like a puzzle piece that had been waiting patiently in the bottom of the box. Mira didn't speak much during those first days, but she watched everything with the careful attention of someone learning a new song by heart. When Kieran's helpers appeared, which they did with increasing frequency as his gift continued to deepen, she would go very still, her small head tilting, as if she were listening to music only she could hear. Her rabbit would be held a little tighter, but there was no fear in her expression, only a kind of recognition that made the hum in Kieran's chest feel less lonely. It was during her second week, when a Meeseeks had materialized to help Henrik untangle his fishing nets and was proceeding to reorganize the entire dock with manic enthusiasm, that Mira spoke her first complete sentence in their house, "Cold spot coming." Kieran paused in his attempt to diplomatically dismiss the overeager helper. "You can feel them, like when the tea kettle gets ready to whistle," she said, her small fingers working at her rabbit's worn fur. "But before it makes the sound." This revelation opened something between them that felt like a door neither had known they'd been waiting for. While Kieran could summon the helpers, Mira could sense their approach, a slight chill in the air, a feeling of electricity gathering like the moment before snow. She became his early warning system, her quiet blue coming giving him precious seconds to consider whether the approaching need truly required magical intervention or if it was one of those surface ripples better left to find their own resolution. There, afternoons developed a rhythm of shared understanding. They would build blanket forts between the kitchen table and the window, creating caves of soft light where the world's urgent needs felt muffled and distant. Henrik would pass plates through the fort opening, simple sandwiches cut into triangles, peanut butter and jam or cheese still warm from the morning's milk, and they would eat slowly, as if slowness were its own form of nourishment. Inside their fabric sanctuary, Mira taught Kieran a language that had nothing to do with words. 3 gentle taps on his shoulder meant, "I'm here with you." A hand resting on his back when the hum grew too insistent meant, "You don't have to carry this alone." She never asked what he was feeling or tried to solve his overwhelming sensitivity to the world's pain. Instead, she simply kept him company until the ache remembered how to loosen, like a knot warming under patient hands. Together they learned to sort the calls that reached him by their depth and urgency. Big hurts, true emergencies, genuine crises, deserved immediate response. Little hurts whispered constantly, but often healed themselves given time and patience. The trickiest category, which they came to call growing hurts, were struggles that looked like problems, but were actually opportunities for someone to discover their own strength. On quiet evenings, when the fog rolled in like a blanket being pulled up to the world's chin, they would sit by the lighthouse window and count the slow sweep of the beacon as it found their glass. "We'll be seen," Mira would whisper. Promise, not prediction, and Kieran began to understand that his gift, which so often pulled him outward toward every voice that called for help, had found its counterweight. In Mira's steady presence, the foghorn no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like a lullaby that belonged to both of them, calling and answering in the rhythm of breath shared between siblings who had learned to carry the world's weight together. The lessons that had been whispered in blanket forts and shared. Over triangular sandwiches began to take clearer shape as Henrik stepped more deliberately into the role of teacher. The old lighthouse keeper had spent decades reading the moods of sea and sky, and he recognized in Kieran's growing sensitivity the same need for navigation tools that helped ships find safe harbor. On mornings when the fog lifted like a curtain, being drawn back from the world's stage, Henrik would guide both children down to the tide pools, where the ocean had left small worlds trapped in stone basins, each one a lesson waiting to be discovered. "Water is generous," Henrik said one particular morning when the rocks still held the night's coolness and the pools reflected sky like mirrors. "But even the ocean pulls back twice each day. Boundaries aren't walls. They're the shoreline of love." He knelt beside a pool where starfish clung to the wet stones, their arms spread like small hands holding tight to what they needed. "We don't lift them from the water, even when they look lonely or lost. We trust the rhythm that keeps them whole." Kieran felt the hum in his chest respond with both recognition and gentle protest. The starfish did look vulnerable, exposed by the retreating tide, and every instinct urged him to help them find deeper water. But Henrik's weathered hand rested on his shoulder like an anchor, and together they watched until the boy began to understand that what looked like abandonment was actually perfect design. The starfish belonged exactly where they were, feeding and resting in the shallow warmth until the tide returned to lift them back to deeper waters. From these tide pool mornings grew a practice of discernment that Henrik called listening with edges. Before responding to any call for help, Kieran learned to take 3 soft breaths, one for the person in need, one for the world around them, and one for himself. If the urgency remained after the 3rd breath, action was warranted. If the feeling had shifted or softened, patience was often the wiser choice. "Ask permission even with your eyes," Henrik taught him, demonstrating how help offered like an open palm felt different from help imposed like a closed fist. They practiced this new wisdom in the village market, where life provided endless opportunities for both helping and witnessing. When a boy's careless elbow sent apples rolling across the cobblestones like red marbles, Kieran felt the familiar leap in his chest, that instant urge to summon blue assistance. But Henrik's gentle presence reminded him to pause, to breathe, to watch. The boy laughed breathlessly at his own clumsiness, and with 2 friends began chasing the scattered fruit, turning accident into game, while the vendor smiled despite himself and offered them a bruised apple to share. The moment repaired itself in small human ways, and Kieran felt the hum in his chest settle into something deeper than relief, a recognition that some problems were actually solutions wearing disguises. Later that same afternoon, when 2 men, carrying a sheet of glass down the narrow lane, struggled against a sudden gust of wind, the pull in Kieran's chest didn't wait for measured breaths. He and Henrik moved together, their hands steadying the pain before wind could transform careful work into dangerous accident. No blue shimmer, no eager helper, just bodies offering presence at the exact moment it mattered most. Mira, watching from nearby with her rabbit tucked under her arm, exhaled softly and said, "That felt like the right size," and Kieran held onto the phrase like a compass bearing. In the evenings, as the beacon swept its slow heartbeat across their window, Henrik would trace invisible maps on the kitchen table with his fingertip. "Your gift lives here," he said, indicating the smallest circle at the center. "But it touches all of these others. The art is choosing where your light falls, so the world grows gentler rather than more dependent. And in that quiet, Kieran began to sense how the hum in his chest was learning a new shape, still responsive to every ache, but now tempered with the wisdom to pause, to ask, and most importantly, to trust that not every call required his particular kind of answer. The wisdom Henrik had planted in tide pool mornings began to bloom in unexpected ways as Kieran moved through his 15th year, when the hum in his chest carried not just the world's immediate needs, but the more complex ache of adolescent hearts learning to navigate their own storms. His gift had grown stronger with his lengthening limbs and deepening voice, but with that strength came a troubling discovery that arrived like a crack appearing in what had seemed like perfect glass. It began with Tommy Brennan, a boy in his mathematics class who wrestled with numbers the way some people wrestle with stubborn knots. Kieran felt Tommy's frustration as a sharp pull behind his ribs every time homework was assigned, and on nights when the call grew too insistent to ignore, he would whisper help into the darkness. A blue shimmer would find Tommy's kitchen table, and by morning, every equation would be solved with perfect precision, each step laid out like stones across a clear stream. Tommy brought these pristine worksheets to school with relief that made Kieran's chest warm with satisfaction. But when the class faced their first test without helpers, without Kieran's breath nearby to summon assistance, Tommy's hands trembled over the page, as if the numbers had become a foreign language. He failed spectacularly, and the confusion in his eyes carried a weight that settled in Kieran's stomach like a stone. Help, given too quickly and completely, had stolen the struggle that grows into genuine understanding. The pattern revealed itself everywhere once Kieran learned to recognize it. His friend Sarah, whose chaotic room he'd sent helpers to organize during her overwhelmed moments, never developed the skills to manage her own belongings. She lived in a strange state of grateful helplessness, her space immaculate after each blue visitation, but her sense of personal responsibility growing thinner, like a muscle that had forgotten its purpose. "I don't know how you do it," she would say, and Kieran began to hear in those words not gratitude but a quiet surrender of her own capability. Henrik, watching Kieran wrestle with this new understanding, offered wisdom in his usual gentle way. "Sometimes," he said one evening as they mended nets by lamplight, "love means stepping back instead of reaching forward. The strongest trees grow against the wind, not sheltered from it." Mira, now 8 and possessed of insights that sometimes surprised even Henrik, added her own observation during one of their blanket fort conversations. "Maybe helping is like teaching someone to swim," she said, her rabbit tucked safely against her chest. "You can hold them up in the water, but if you never let go, they never learn to float." This sparked something different in Kieran's approach, a new kind of listening that heard not just what people needed, but what they needed to learn to provide for themselves. When Tommy struggled with equations now, Kieran might offer a gentle hint about where to look for patterns, but he kept his hands still and let the boy work through the actual solving. The light in Tommy's face when he completed his first problem entirely alone was worth more than any magical efficiency could have provided. The hum in Kieran's chest began to change quality, shifting from urgent demand to something more like a patient current, flowing around obstacles rather than blasting through them. He discovered that sometimes the most profound help looked like trust, sounded like, "I believe you can figure this out," and felt like the gentle restraint of hands that knew when not to reach forward. In learning to say no, not from indifference, but from deeper care, both he and those around him found space to grow stronger. The lessons about restraint had settled into Kieran's bones like winter settling into stone, but his gift seemed determined to test every boundary he tried to build. Sleep, which had once come as naturally as the tide's retreat, now felt like a distant country he could no longer reach. The hum in his chest had grown stronger with his 16th year, pulsing with an intensity that made the lighthouse walls feel too thin to contain all the world's whispered needs. Every dropped worry, every moment of human struggle called to him through darkness and distance, until rest became impossible and dawn found him hollow-eyed at the kitchen table. Henrik discovered him there one such morning, surrounded by the fading blue shimmer of recently dismissed helpers. "For last night?" Kieran said without looking up, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had been swimming against an endless current. "And there will be 4 more tonight. And 4 more. After that." The old lighthouse keeper settled across from him with tea that steamed like visible prayers. "The ocean never stops moving," Henrik said quietly, "but the lighthouse doesn't try to calm every wave. It offers one thing, steady light, and trusts the sailors to navigate by it." His weathered fingers traced the table's grain as if reading a map. "Perhaps your light needs a different place to shine." Restlessness pulled Kieran toward the door and into night air that carried salt and the patient rhythm of waves against stone. Without conscious plan, he found himself behind the lighthouse, where a neglected patch of earth waited between the building's foundation and the low stone wall that marked their property. Moonlight painted the stubborn soil silver, and something, in its quiet persistence, called to the ache in his chest, not urgently, but with the gentle invitation of possibility. He knelt and pressed his palms against the cool earth, feeling its gritty reality beneath his fingers. Here was need of a different kind entirely, not the sharp call for immediate intervention, but the patient request for partnership. This soil wanted help, but help that unfolded slowly, that worked with natural rhythms rather than against them. The Meeseeks could fix broken things in moments, could organize chaos with eager efficiency, but they couldn't coax a seed to trust the darkness enough to sprout, couldn't teach roots to find water through patient searching. Kieran began to turn the earth with his hands, working stones loose and smoothing furrows with the same careful attention he'd once reserved for Henrik's fishing nets. This was helping without magic, assistance that required presence rather than power. Each handful of soil felt like a small conversation, each cleared space an invitation for something new to grow in its own time. When Mira appeared with her rabbit tucked against her shoulder, settling quietly on the stone wall to keep him company, the work took on the quality of shared prayer. The hum in his chest began to change, settling into harmony with slower rhythms, the gradual unfurling of possibility, the patient work of roots and rain and time. Here, between lighthouse sweeps and the gentle sound of his sister's breathing, Kieran discovered that some forms of helping fed his spirit rather than draining it, teaching him that growth, unlike fixing, was a conversation that could last a lifetime without ever feeling like too much. The garden's patient lessons had begun to change the quality of listening itself, and Henrik, watching Kieran work the soil with increasing reverence, recognized that the boy was ready for deeper navigation. On mornings when fog wrapped the lighthouse like a grey shawl, the old keeper would guide Kieran down to the shore, where different winds told different stories across the water. "The sea speaks many languages," Henrik said, his weathered hand gesturing toward the horizon. "Sharp squalls that demand immediate shelter, steady breezes that simply move things along, and deep sighs that carry the weight of distant storms. People call for help in much the same way." Standing where waves met stone, Kieran felt the hum in his chest respond to Henrik's words like a tuning fork finding its proper note. The calls that reached him did indeed carry different textures, different urgencies, and learning to distinguish between them felt like developing a new sense entirely. Henrik taught him to recognize the sharp cry of genuine emergency, the kind that hit his awareness like lightning, demanding swift response. These were the calls that deserved his Meeseeks friends, their eager efficiency perfectly matched to crises that needed immediate resolution. But there were gentler calls too, the persistent whisper of everyday frustrations that pulsed like a steady heartbeat rather than a sudden alarm. A stubborn jar lid, a fence post that wouldn't stay straight, the small tangles that wove themselves into ordinary days. For these, Henrik explained, magical assistance often created more disruption than relief. "Sometimes," he said, "the kindest response is simply acknowledging that yes, life can be wonderfully, frustratingly imperfect." The deepest category was the hardest to name because it rarely asked for anything specific. It arrived like the feeling of an empty chair at a familiar table, a wordless ache that spoke of loneliness, loss, or the simple weight of being human in a world that sometimes felt too vast to navigate alone. When such calls reached him, Kieran learned to offer something different entirely, not solutions but presence. They encountered this deeper need on a morning when fog hung so thick they nearly walked past Mrs. Adelaide, sitting on a piece of driftwood, her quiet weeping barely audible above the waves. Kieran felt the familiar pull to summon help, to fix whatever was causing such sorrow. But Henrik's gentle touch reminded him to pause, to listen with more than just his gift. "My Thomas would have been 68 today," she said when she noticed them, her voice carrying no shame about being discovered. In her grief. 20 years he's been gone, and still these anniversaries find me like old friends. She wiped her eyes with the corner of her shawl. "I don't need fixing, dear ones. I just need the fog to hold me while I remember." They sat with her in comfortable silence, 3 figures wrapped in grey mourning, while Kieran learned that some pain was not a problem to be solved, but a conversation between heart and memory that deserved witness. The hum in his chest settled into something steadier, like a hand resting gently on someone's back while they worked through what needed working through. When Mrs. Adelaide rose to continue her walk, she touched Kieran's cheek with salt-scented fingers. "You have listening eyes," she said. "That's rarer than kindness itself." Walking home through the lifting fog, Kieran understood that his gift had grown beyond summoning helpers. It had become the ability to recognize which struggles asked for intervention and which asked only for the grace of being truly seen. The chi. Understanding that some pain asked only for witness rather than intervention had settled into Kieran's bones like morning settling into stone. But his hands seemed to carry a different kind of wisdom entirely. Walking home from the shore where Mrs. Adelaide had taught him about the grace of being truly seen, he felt something shift in the hum that lived behind his ribs. Not urgent demand, but a gentle current flowing toward a different kind of response. Altogether, in the lighthouse kitchen, with afternoon light slanting through salt-touched windows, Kieran found himself drawn to the simple wooden board where Henrik prepared their meals. Without conscious plan, his hands began moving with the same careful attention he brought to tending plants, reaching for bread still warm from the village bakery, spreading butter with deliberate care to every edge, layering thin slices of cheese that Henrik had traded for lighthouse maintenance work. There was something about creating nourishment with his own hands, without shimmer or eager helpers, that satisfied a part of his gift he hadn't known was hungry. Each movement felt like prayer made tangible. The precise spreading of preserves from their garden's late berries, the thoughtful addition of lettuce still carrying drops of morning dew, the careful cut that created 2 perfect triangles. This was helping without magic, assistance that required presence rather than power, and the hum in his chest settled into something warmer and more sustainable than urgent response. Mira appeared as he wrapped the sandwich in clean cloth, her rabbit tucked against her shoulder, and that particular stillness that meant she was reading the air around them. "Different kind of blue coming," she said softly, then paused, tilting her head. "No, not blue at all. Something warmer." When the call came, not sharp crisis, but the soft ache of someone whose reserves had been running empty too long, Kieran walked to the village with the wrapped sandwich cradled in his palms like a letter he hoped would be kept. He found the source near the docks. Marcus, the baker whose flour-dusted apron couldn't hide the exhaustion etched around his eyes, sitting on a crate with his shoulders rounded under invisible weight. "When did you last eat something you didn't have to think about?" Kieran asked, offering the cloth-wrapped triangle with the same gentle care he'd learned to use when approaching startled birds. Marcus accepted the sandwich with hands that trembled slightly, and when he bit into it, his whole body seemed to exhale months of held tension. "This tastes like someone cares," he said, and the simple words carried more gratitude than any magical solution had ever earned. Walking home through air that smelled of salt and possibility, Kieran understood that his gift had found a new expression, one that fed his spirit rather than draining it. In their kitchen that evening, as Mira helped arrange napkins like small flags of comfort, she offered her own insight with the seriousness children bring to sacred discoveries. "The helpers fix things, but your hands put love inside the food, the pa." Ritual grew roots in the days that followed. Kieran learned to distinguish between needs that called for blue efficiency and those that asked for the patient work of human hands, for nourishment created with intention, and offered without expectation. Some hungers, he discovered, could only be satisfied by the warmth of bread made with care, by the silent understanding that passed between two people when one offered sustenance and the other received it with grateful hands. The sandwich ritual had grown into something sacred over the weeks that followed, each wrapped triangle carrying intention and presence like letters written in the language of care. But even this gentler form of helping brought questions that hummed beneath Kieran's growing understanding, and those questions found their answer in the form of a merchant whose cart rolled into their village on a morning when fog made the world feel wrapped in grey silk. She appeared like someone the mist had been carrying for miles, her wagon painted in colours that had faded to kindness, pulled by horses, whose patient eyes suggested they had seen many shores. When she stepped down, bells sewn into her coat's hem chimed softly, barely audible above the harbour's gentle sounds. Her eyes held the deep calm of river water, and when she smiled at Kieran offering his careful sandwiches to the dock workers, it felt like she already knew the hum that lived behind his ribs. "You look like someone learning to swim in deep water," she said, settling beside him on the stone wall that bordered the harbour. There was no judgment in her voice, only the gentle recognition of someone who had watched others navigate similar currents. "I've known others with gifts like yours, the ones who feel every leak in the world's boat and think they need to patch them all." Mira appeared with her rabbit tucked against her shoulder, that particular stillness settling around her that meant she was reading the air. Henrik, arranging his nets nearby, gave a small nod as if to say, "This is one of your teachers." The merchant noticed their quiet attention and smiled with the warmth of someone accustomed to speaking to families bound by more than blood. "There's something I call the river of tasks," she said, her weathered hands gesturing toward the harbour, where boats moved in and out with the tide's ancient rhythm. In every life, there flows a constant stream of things that need doing. Problems that call for attention, small frictions that wear at the spirit, endless little needs that whisper for help. "Look there at your lighthouse." Kieran turned toward the familiar beacon that had guided his entire life, its steady sweep painting silver paths across the water. "Your light doesn't try to illuminate every shadow," the merchant continued. "It shines steadily in one direction, and ships navigate by that constancy. A lighthouse that tried to reach every darkness would burn out its beacon, but one that holds its course guides countless vessels safely home." From her coat pocket, she drew a smooth black stone with a pale vein running through its center, like captured moonlight. "This came from a riverbed where I learned to distinguish between currents," she said, placing it in Kieran's palm, where it warmed as if remembering sunlight. "Feel for weight, not volume. 1,000 light things can pass through you without harm. One heavy thing, held at the right moment, can change a shoreline." They walked to the stream that slipped behind the village before widening into the sea, and there she taught him to practice what she called selective attention. "Stand on this stone in your mind when needs come rushing," she said, kneeling to wet her fingers in the clear water. "If you feel your feet slip, let the small ones flow on. The river moves whether you clutch at every drop or not." Practice found them before theory could cool. A merchant cursed softly as he juggled too many parcels, and Kieran felt the familiar tug to summon help. But holding the stone, he recognized the light quality of this need, foam rather than undertow. He stepped aside, allowing the moment to find its own resolution. The parcels settled on a nearby bench without disaster, and the man laughed at his own clumsiness, a little embarrassed but wiser about his own capabilities. Minutes later, a child's sharp cry cut through the market noise, not frustration, but genuine fear. This call landed in Kieran's chest like an anchor, heavy with true need. He didn't summon blue helpers. Instead, he knelt to the child's height and offered steady presence. "Shall we look together?" he asked, and they found the worried mother 3 stalls away, the reunion quiet and complete. Walking home through air that carried salt and new understanding, Kieran felt the hum in his chest settle into a different rhythm. The stone rested warm in his pocket, and the lighthouse's familiar sweep seemed to pulse in harmony with his heartbeat. "It feels like choosing which notes not to play," he said to Mira and Henrik as they shared evening tea, "so the melody can breathe." That night, as the beacon painted its patient circle across their window, Kieran understood that his gift had found its proper shore. The river of tasks would always flow, carrying its endless invitations and urgent whispers. But now he stood, with wet feet and a good stone in his pocket, choosing moments with the care of someone who had learned that even infinite compassion required the wisdom of boundaries. The merchant's stone had become Kieran's compass through the endless currents of need, its smooth weight a reminder that even infinite compassion required the wisdom of boundaries. But wisdom, like any living thing, needed testing to grow stronger, and that test arrived on a morning when autumn light painted the village in shades of amber and gold. The call came sharp and clear, not the gentle whisper of everyday friction, but the urgent pulse that meant genuine danger. Mrs. Gable stood wobbling on a chair in her cluttered cottage, reaching toward a high shelf where a jar of preserves waited like a stubborn memory. Her arthritis-bent fingers trembled with the effort, and the chair beneath her creaked ominously with each stretch. The hum in Kieran's chest didn't hesitate. This was exactly the kind of moment that deserved swift intervention. He whispered help, and the familiar blue shimmer bloomed into the small room with eager efficiency. The Meeseeks steadied Mrs. Gable with gentle hands, retrieved the jar with careful precision, and helped her safely to the floor. "Oh, bless you, dearie," she breathed, clutching the preserves to her chest with grateful relief. The task was complete. The danger passed, and for a moment the cottage felt perfectly balanced. But balance, Kieran had learned, required constant tending. Even before Mrs. Gable had finished thanking their visitor, the helper began to move with that familiar zeal that had once reorganized entire bakeries. It dusted every surface within reach, then began sorting her collection of seashells by size and color. When that was finished, it started arranging her books, then moved to the garden visible through the window, pulling weeds with mechanical precision that bordered on frantic. "Thank you," Kieran said gently, using the words that usually brought peaceful dismissal. "That's enough now." The helper paused, its bright form flickering like a candle in wind. "Enough," it repeated, the words seeming foreign in its cheerful voice. "But there's more to fix. There's always more." It gestured toward the cottage, the garden, the world beyond. "If I stop helping, what am I?" The question landed in Kieran's chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of recognition through his own understanding. He had asked himself the same thing during those sleepless nights when the world's needs felt endless and overwhelming. Sitting on Mrs. Gable's worn sofa, he watched the helper's restless energy with new eyes, seeing not malfunction, but mirror. "Come, sit with me," Kieran said, patting the cushion beside him. The helper approached with hesitant steps, its usual bounce replaced by something closer to confusion. From his bag, Kieran drew a sandwich wrapped in clean cloth, bread still warm from the morning's baking, cheese and apple slices, arranged with the same care he brought to tending his garden. "Sometimes," he said, offering the simple meal like a prayer made tangible, "the kindest thing is learning when help is complete, not because there's nothing left to do, but because rest is part of the rhythm too." They sat together in comfortable silence, the helper's frantic energy gradually settling into something quieter and more sustainable. The blue shimmer around its edges softened, like water finding its natural level after disturbance. When it finally spoke, its voice carried a new quality, not the desperate cheer of endless productivity, but the gentle satisfaction of work truly finished. "If help is complete," it said slowly, "then I can rest until I'm needed again." "Yes," Kieran whispered, and the helper dissolved with what sounded almost like a sigh of relief, leaving behind only the faintest scent of rain and the warm understanding that even magical assistants needed to learn the revolutionary concept of enough. Walking, home through air that carried autumn's patient wisdom, Kieran felt the hum in his chest settle into a new rhythm. He had learned to teach completion, and in doing so had discovered that his gift was evolving beyond summoning help. It was becoming the ability to recognize when help, like all good things, needed the grace of gentle endings. The lesson about teaching completion had settled into Kieran's understanding, like morning settling into stone, and it carried him, almost without conscious decision, past the harbor where fishing boats rocked in gentle rhythm with the tide. The scent of fresh bread drew him toward the bakery like a compass needle, finding true north. And there she was, Elena, her hands moving through flour and dough with the same patient attention he brought to his midnight garden. She worked without urgency, kneading bread with steady pressure that spoke of deep trust in processes that unfolded in their own time. When she looked up and noticed him watching through the window, her smile carried no surprise, only the gentle acknowledgement of someone who had been expecting him without knowing it. The hum in his chest, which had grown so sensitive to every call for help, settled into something quieter in her presence, not silence but harmony. "You look like someone who's been learning difficult lessons," she said when he stepped inside, her voice carrying the warmth of ovens and the patience of rising dough. She didn't ask about the blue shimmer that sometimes followed in his wake, or the way people's burdens seemed to lighten when he was near. Instead, she offered him the heel of warm bread, with the same natural grace she brought to every movement. The bread tasted like care made tangible, and something in Kieran's chest loosened, a knot he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "How? Do you know when the dough is ready?" he asked, watching her hands test the elasticity of what would become tomorrow's loaves. "It tells you," Eleanor said simply, pressing gently into the pale surface and watching how it responded. "Not with words, but with the way it feels under your fingers. Push too hard and you'll tear it. Not hard enough and it won't grow strong. The secret is learning to listen with your hands." When a delivery cart arrived with sacks of flour that needed moving, Kieran reached instinctively for the word that could summon eager blue assistance. But Elena was already lifting, her movements steady and sure, and something in her quiet competence made him choose differently. "I can help," he said, meaning his own hands, his own back, his own presence. Together they carried weight the long way, shoulder to shoulder, and the work felt like prayer made physical. "Not everything needs hurrying," Eleanor said afterward, pouring tea that steamed like visible comfort. "Some things grow better when they're allowed to take their time." She didn't look at him when she said it, but Kieran felt the words settle into the space where his gift lived, offering a different way of understanding the endless pull he felt toward the world's needs. In the days that followed, the bakery became a place where Kieran could practice a skill he had long avoided, receiving care. Elena made it easy by never making it a lesson. She simply existed in the warm space between flour and friendship, steady as the lighthouse beacon, that had guided his entire life. When he told her about the hum that lived behind his ribs, she listened the way she listened to dough, checking for readiness, for what was needed, for what could wait. "Who listens to you?" she asked quietly, and when he had no answer, she touched his sleeve like a promise. "You can sit here sometimes and be the one cared for." Walking home through air that carried the scent of yeast and possibility, Kieran felt something shift in the rhythm of his days. Elena's presence didn't diminish his gift or solve the endless pull of the world's needs, but it offered something he hadn't known he was hungry for, the steady understanding that even helpers needed help, even listeners needed to be heard. Their love would grow slowly, like bread rising twice, built on the recognition that some connections required no magic to sustain them, only the daily choice to tend each other's hearts with the same patience they brought to everything else. That mattered. The warmth Elena had brought to his days created space for Kieran to notice what he might have missed before. The way Henrik moved more carefully through morning routines, how he paused longer between tasks, as if listening to conversations only he could hear. Winter had settled into the lighthouse keeper's bones like tide pools filling with cold water, and though he maintained the same deliberate grace that had guided Kieran's entire life, there was something different in the rhythm of his steps, a gentle slowing that spoke of seasons preparing to turn. Elena, who had begun joining their morning rituals with the natural ease of someone who belonged, noticed it too. She would pour Henrik's tea with extra care, making sure the cup warmed his weathered hands, and her presence seemed to give the old keeper permission to rest more deeply into the comfort of being tended. "You're learning to receive care as gracefully as you give it," Henrik observed one foggy dawn, his eyes following the beacon's sweep as it painted silver paths across their window. It was during these quieter mornings that Henrik began what he called his lessons of leaving, not bitter instruction about endings, but gentle teaching about the beauty that lived in incompletion itself. He led Kieran and Mira to the lamp, room where the great lens threw softened light across them, and there he showed them his fishing net, deliberately left with a small gap near one edge. "A mercy hole," Henrik explained, running his fingers along the carefully maintained opening. "Not everything that can be caught should be kept. This little gap spares us from our own greed, lets the two small fish slip back to grow stronger." He looked at Kieran with eyes that had learned to read storms by scent alone. "Your gift is like that net. Fix what is truly breaking, but leave some struggles unresolved so hearts have room to grow." The distinction between responsibility and ownership became Henrik's deepest teaching. "You feel accountable for every need that calls to you," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades guiding others safely home. "But the world's pain existed before your gift awakened, and it will continue after your particular way of helping changes form. You're not the owner of every problem. You're the tender of your portion, and that's enough." As his strength continued to ebb like tide retreating from familiar shores, Henrik gathered them close one evening when the fog hung thick enough to muffle even the ocean's voice. Elena sat beside him, her steady presence anchoring them all, while Mira held his hand with the gentle certainty of someone who had always known how to offer comfort. From his pocket, Henrik drew a small brass key, its metal warmed by years of carrying. "This opens the keeper's log," he said, placing it in Kieran's palm. "You'll find blank pages at the back I never filled. Leave some of them untouched. Let the wind write a few entries in its own way." His smile carried the peace of someone who had learned to distinguish between problems that needed solving and mysteries that deserved honoring. When sleep came for Henrik that night, it came like a tide that remembered the shore's name, gentle and inevitable. The beacon continued its sweep, painting light across his peaceful face before moving on, carrying his quiet presence into the vast mysteries beyond. In the stillness that followed, Kieran felt the hum in his chest settle into something deeper than urgency, a recognition that some things were meant to remain beautifully, purposefully unfinished, and that wisdom lay not in completing every task, but in knowing which ones truly needed his particular kind of attention. The brass key rested, warm in his pocket, a promise to tend what mattered while trusting the world to write its own stories in the spaces he learned to leave open. The brass key had grown warm in Kieran's pocket through the weeks that followed Henrik's gentle departure, and with that warmth came a different understanding of what it meant to tend rather than fix. The village, which had always felt the subtle influence of his gift, began to experience something new, not the swift resolution of blue helpers, but the patient cultivation of their own capacity for care. When he finally turned the key in the keeper's log, blank pages breathed back at him like a quiet shore, inviting footprints he had never thought to make. He began not with grand announcements or formal meetings, but by living his days with the intention Henrik had taught him to recognize. When Mrs. Chen's arthritis called to him like a bell only he could hear, instead of summoning helpers to ease her morning stiffness, he found himself visiting with sandwiches and the kind of listening that asked nothing but offered everything. Soon her neighbor Mr. Torres began stopping by with tea that helped joint pain, and Mrs. Chen started sharing stories that made loneliness feel lighter. What had once required magical intervention now flourished through human connection, creating ripples that reached further than any blue shimmer ever could. The pattern revealed itself everywhere once he learned to look for it. Young Tommy Brennan, who had once depended on blue assistance for his mathematics, now studied with Sarah in the bakery, where Eleanor provided warm milk and patient encouragement. "We're teaching each other," Tommy told Kieran one afternoon, his face bright with the particular pride that comes from genuine accomplishment. The homework circle they formed became a small miracle of mutual support, proving that some help grew stronger when it flowed both ways. Elena, whose steady presence had become as essential as the lighthouse beacon itself, noticed what was blooming in these connections. "People are learning to carry each other," she observed one evening as they walked the shore where Henrik had taught Kieran to read different kinds of calls. Maybe it needs a name, something that honors both its purpose and its gentle boundaries. From these conversations grew what they called the Guild of Gentle Helpers, not a formal organization with rules and meetings, but a quiet fellowship of individuals who sought to offer aid without becoming enslaved to others' needs. The first gathering happened naturally in the lighthouse lamproom, where Henrik's great lens threw softened light across faces that had learned to recognize the difference between helping and healing. Mira, now grown into her own quiet wisdom, helped arrange simple refreshments, while Kieran shared what Henrik had taught him about the mercy hole in fishing nets, how some struggles were meant to be left unresolved, so hearts had room to grow stronger. They practiced together the art of listening with edges, learning to take 3 soft breaths before responding to any call. 1 for the person in need, 1 for the world around them, and 1 for themselves. Mrs. Adelaide, whose grief had taught Kieran about the grace of being truly seen, became their teacher in the skill of sitting with pain without trying to fix it. "Sometimes," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to befriend sorrow, "the kindest thing is simply holding space for someone's struggle without rushing to make it disappear." The guild grew slowly, organically, like everything that was meant to last. Members learned to offer help like open palms rather than closed fists, to ask permission even with their eyes, to recognize when someone needed to work through something alone. They discovered that the most powerful assistance often looked like trust, sounded like, "I believe you can figure this out," and felt like the gentle restraint of hands that knew when not to reach forward. Walking home through air that carried salt and the scent of possibility, Kieran felt the hum in his chest settle into a rhythm that matched the lighthouse beacon's patient sweep. The guild was learning to be a different kind of light, not trying to illuminate every shadow, but shining steadily in one direction, trusting others to navigate by that constancy toward their own forms of gentle strength. The Guild of Gentle. Helpers had found its rhythm in the weeks following Henrik's departure, their meetings flowing like conversations between old friends who had learned to trust each other's wisdom. But understanding, like any living thing, required testing to grow deeper roots, and that test arrived on a morning when autumn light painted the village in shades of amber and gentle challenge. The boy appeared at the market like a question written, in shadow and silence, perhaps 7 years old but carrying himself with the careful distance of someone much older. He moved through the crowd like water finding its way around stones, never quite touching anyone, his eyes holding the particular emptiness that comes from having been helped too many times in ways that felt more like harm. Elena, arranging fresh loaves at her bakery stall, noticed him first, the way he watched food with hunger but wouldn't approach, as if even basic needs had become dangerous territory. When Kieran felt the familiar tug in his chest, it came not as the sharp call of immediate crisis, but as something deeper and more complex, pain wrapped in layers too thick for simple intervention. The hum behind his ribs pulsed with recognition of genuine need, and without conscious thought he whispered help into the morning air. The blue shimmer began to bloom near the child, gentle as always, eager to assist. But the boy's reaction was immediate and devastating. He pressed himself against the nearest wall, his small body rigid with terror that went far beyond ordinary fear. "No," he whispered, the word carrying such authority that even the Meeseeks paused in its materialization. "Please, no more helpers." Kieran dismissed the blue presence immediately, watching it dissolve like morning mist, while understanding settled in his chest like a stone finding the bottom of still water. Here was trauma that magical assistance couldn't touch, wounds that had been carved not by accident or circumstance, but by help itself, help that had been imposed rather than offered, assistance that had taken more than it gave. The guild gathered that afternoon in Elena's bakery, their usual meeting place warm with the scent of rising dough and patient wisdom. Mrs. Adelaide spoke first, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to befriend her own deepest sorrows. "Some pain isn't meant to be fixed," she said gently. "It's meant to be witnessed, held in the light until it remembers its own capacity to heal." Mira, now 12 and possessed of insights that sometimes surprised even the adults, offered her own understanding while arranging her worn rabbit on the table between them. "Maybe he needs to know that being broken doesn't make you less worthy of love," she said, her fingers tracing the toy's carefully mended seams. "Patches here has been torn and sewn back together so many times, he's more repairs than original fabric, but that just makes him softer." In the days that followed, they learned to practice a different kind of care, the radical act of offering presents without demanding acceptance. Eleanor would leave a warm roll on the bench where the boy sometimes sat, then walk away without looking back. Kieran learned to share the same space without trying to bridge the distance, simply existing nearby like a lighthouse that offered steady light without insisting that ships navigate toward it. The breakthrough, when it came, was barely visible. The boy accepting a cup of water from Elena's hands, sitting 3 feet closer to where Mira played with her rabbit, allowing Kieran to remain in the same small space without fleeing. Progress measured not in dramatic transformation, but in the gradual softening of shoulders, the slight lessening of the distance he kept between himself and the world. Walking home through air that carried salt and the scent of patience rewarded, Kieran felt the hum in his chest settle into something deeper than urgency. He had learned perhaps his most important lesson, that sometimes the greatest help was bearing witness to someone's pain without trying to fix it, offering presence without demanding trust, creating space where healing could happen at its own pace or choose not to happen at all, and that this too was a form of love worth mastering. The lesson of bearing witness had settled into Kieran's understanding like morning settling into stone, but it was in watching Mira that he began to recognize how his own gift had always been only half of a larger conversation. She moved through her 13th year with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to read the world's unspoken languages, and her particular form of helping revealed itself not in dramatic moments, but in the gentle spaces between heartbeats, where sorrow needed nothing more than steady companionship. It began with Mrs. Chen, who arrived at one of their evening gatherings carrying the weight of sleepless nights spent beside her husband's sickbed. The careful balance she had maintained between hope and fear was beginning to fracture under too many unknowns, and while the others offered gentle words and practical suggestions, Mira simply moved her chair closer and settled into the kind of stillness that felt like an invitation rather than intrusion. She didn't speak, didn't try to solve or fix or ease the older woman's pain. Instead, she became a steady presence that asked nothing and judged nothing, her quiet attention creating space where sorrow could exist without shame. Something in Mrs. Chen's shoulders began to soften, rigid control giving way to tears that had been waiting for permission to fall. When Mira reached across the small distance to take her hand, it wasn't to comfort or console, but simply to anchor her while grief moved through like weather passing over still water. "You don't try to fix me," Mrs. Chen whispered when the storm had passed, wonder threading through her voice. "You just sit with me while I feel what I need to feel." The boy who had taught them all about the limits of imposed assistance was among the first to seek out this different form of care. He appeared at the bakery one afternoon when rain drummed against windows like patient fingers, settling on the floor near where Mira sat, mending her rabbit's worn ear. For an hour they shared comfortable silence, and when she placed a smooth stone in his palm and said quietly, "This one likes pockets," his acceptance of the small gift marked something shifting in the careful distance he kept between himself and the world. Their gifts began working in harmony like two instruments finding the same key. When Kieran felt the familiar pull towards someone's distress, he learned to pause and consider whether the need called for active assistance or the deeper medicine of patient accompaniment. If the latter, he would find Mira, and together they offered what each situation truly required. His careful discernment about when to act, her steady presence that allowed others to act for themselves. Even the helpers began to respond to Mira's particular wisdom. When a Meeseeks lingered after completing its task, bright with leftover purpose and uncertain how to settle, she would step toward it with the same kindness she gave to skittish animals and sleepless children. "You did well," she said softly, to one such helper. "The rest is ours now." She poured tea and placed it where the blue figure could almost hold it, teaching even magical assistants that enough was a kind of love, that completion could be gentle rather than frantic. Walking. Home through rain that washed the world clean, Kieran felt the hum in his chest settle into perfect harmony with the rhythm of his sister's steady breathing. Elena's earlier observation echoed in his mind. While Kieran learned to summon help, Mira became the help itself. They had discovered how to be different kinds of light, his reaching outward to illuminate specific needs, hers burning steadily inward to warm whatever heart needed tending. Together, they created something more complete than either gift alone could offer, proving that even the most generous hearts grew stronger when they learned to dance with their perfect complement. The harmony between their complementary gifts had grown as natural as breathing, creating space for discoveries neither Kieran nor Mira could have anticipated alone. It was during one of those busy harbor mornings, when fishing boats returned with nets that had tangled themselves into puzzles only patient hands could solve, that the deeper evolution of Kieran's helpers revealed itself in ways that would change everything they thought they understood about the nature of assistance. The familiar blue shimmer had appeared in response to the fisherman's frustrated calls, and the Meeseeks worked with its usual eager efficiency to untangle the most stubborn knots. But when the task was complete, nets spread clean and ready for the next day's work, the helper didn't dissolve as expected. Instead, it settled on a coil of rope and watched the fishermen continue their work with their own weathered hands, its bright form flickering with something that looked remarkably like curiosity. "What happens?" the helper asked, its voice carrying a weight that made the salt air seem to pause, "when there's nothing left to fix?" The question landed in Kieran's chest like recognition finding its home. He had wrestled with the same uncertainty during those sleepless nights, when the world's endless needs felt like a tide that never retreated, but hearing it from one of his helpers revealed something profound. Even magical assistance could grow, weary of its own relentless purpose, could hunger for meaning beyond the next task to complete. Elena approached with the gentle care she brought to anything that seemed fragile, offering the helper a piece of soft dough she had been experimenting with for the morning's bread. "Would you like to try something different?" she asked. "Not fixing or organizing, just being." The blue figure accepted the dough with hands that trembled slightly, as if purposeless activity was territory too foreign to navigate safely. But when it began to shape the soft mass, not into anything useful or organized, simply following the pleasure of texture and possibility, something in its eager brightness settled into a different quality entirely, like water finding its natural level after disturbance. Mira joined them with her rabbit tucked against her shoulder, settling into the kind of stillness that invited rather than demanded. She watched the helper work the dough with the same patient attention she gave to anyone learning to exist in spaces between urgency and peace. "Rest can be its own kind of work," she said softly, and the helper's form seemed to breathe with new understanding. From that morning forward, Kieran began teaching his helpers what he came to think of as completion ceremonies, small rituals that honored their service while introducing the revolutionary concept that enough was not abandonment, but fulfillment. Some learned to sit quietly in Elena's garden, their bright forms gradually dimming to gentle glows as they practiced stillness. Others discovered pleasure in simple observation, watching clouds move across sky or waves find rhythm against stone. When the helper finally dissolved that day, it wasn't with the usual pop of dismissal, but like morning mist returning to the sea, leaving behind only the faintest scent of rain and a sense of contentment that seemed to settle into the very air around them. Walking home through afternoon light that carried salt and transformation, Kieran felt the hum in his chest settle into a rhythm that matched not urgency, but peace. In teaching his helpers to rest, he had discovered his own need for the same. Grace, the understanding that even infinite compassion required spaces between one helping and the next, moments when the world could hold itself together while hearts learned the gentle art of simply being. The lessons about teaching completion had settled into Kieran's understanding, like morning settling into stone, but it was Eleanor who recognized what still needed tending in the careful architecture of his days. She found him in her bakery before dawn, arranging flour sacks with the same meticulous attention he brought to dismissing helpers. Everything precise, purposeful, perfectly controlled. The sight made something gentle and knowing settle in her chest, like recognizing a song she had been waiting to hear. "What if your need to help others," she said quietly, her flour-dusted hands resting on the wooden counter like anchors, "is really about avoiding your own need to be helped?" The words landed in Kieran's chest like recognition finding its home, sending ripples through understanding he had thought was complete. The hum that lived behind his ribs seemed to pause, as if hearing truth in a voice it had been waiting for. He had become so accustomed to being the lighthouse, steady, reliable, always reaching toward others' darkness, that the possibility of needing his own beacon felt like learning to breathe underwater. Even lighthouses need their foundations. "Tended," Elena continued, watching his face with the patient attention she brought to reading Doe's readiness. "Who trims your wick, Kieran? Who tends the keeper?" The question opened something in him that felt both terrifying and deeply necessary. Around them, the bakery held the warm silence of early morning, when the world felt small enough to contain difficult truths without breaking. He realized he had been so busy listening to every call that reached him that he had never learned to hear the quiet voice of his own needs, had never practiced the vulnerable art of asking rather than offering. Elena began teaching him through the simplest gestures. When she offered bread still warm from the oven, instead of eating quickly and moving on to other concerns, she encouraged him to sit with the nourishment, to feel how his body received what it needed. When Mira appeared with tea prepared exactly as he liked it, Elena nodded toward the gift with gentle insistence. "Practice saying thank you as if you mean it. Practice letting it matter." The Guild of Gentle Helpers, recognizing the shift in their teacher's understanding, began including him in their own practices of mutual support. Mrs. Adelaide, whose grief had taught them all about the grace of being witnessed, offered her own insight with characteristic directness. "Helping can become its own kind of hiding, dear one. Sometimes we tend others' gardens so carefully because we're afraid to look at what's growing in our own soil." When the next crisis called, a neighbor's fence damaged by autumn storms, Kieran felt the familiar pull to summon swift blue assistance. But Elena's question echoed in his awareness, and instead of reaching for magical solutions, he found himself walking to the damaged property with empty hands and an open heart. "I could call helpers," he said to the gathered neighbors, his voice carrying new vulnerability. "But maybe we could work together instead." What followed was an afternoon of shared labor that fed his spirit rather than draining it. When someone brought sandwiches to sustain the workers, Kieran accepted the food with the same grace he had learned to bring to giving it, understanding, finally, that the circle of care was only complete when he allowed himself to be held by the same gentle hands he had spent his life extending to others. Walking home through air that smelled of rain and possibility, Elena's hand warm in his, Kieran felt the hum in his chest settle into something deeper than urgency, a recognition that true helping required the courage to be helped, and that even the most generous hearts grew stronger when they learned to receive as gracefully as they gave. The understanding Elena had awakened about receiving care had begun to reshape the very architecture of Kieran's responses, creating space for a different kind of courage to bloom when the world called for help. That courage found its deepest test on a night when autumn wind carried more than salt and fog. It brought the sharp scent of smoke and the urgent clang of the village bell cutting through darkness like a blade. From the lighthouse steps, Kieran could see orange light dancing where it didn't belong, painting the cooper's workshop in colors that spoke of genuine emergency. The hum in his chest responded immediately, pulsing with that particular intensity that meant lives hung in the balance, and swift action could mean the difference between manageable loss and devastating tragedy. The familiar word help was already forming on his lips, an army of eager blue assistants waiting just one whisper away. But Elena's question echoed through his awareness like a bell that had learned to ring with different meaning. What if this moment asked not for his gift, but for his presence? He took the 3 breaths Henrik had taught him, one for those in danger, one for the world holding them, one for himself. The weight remained steady and true, but something deeper had shifted in how he chose to answer it. Instead of summoning magical intervention, Kieran ran toward the fire with empty hands and an open heart, joining the bucket brigade that was already forming like a river of human cooperation. Eleanor appeared at his shoulder, her baker's strength put to work passing water with the same steady rhythm she brought to kneading dough. Mira organized the frightened children with her quiet authority, while Mrs. Chen gripped buckets with stubborn dignity despite her arthritis, and Tommy Brennan used his hard-won mathematical understanding to direct water streams more effectively. The work was immediate and completely human. Kieran's hands grew raw from rope and bucket handles. His lungs burned with smoke and effort, but something in his chest settled deeper than relief as he felt his own physical presence making measurable difference. When sparks threatened a neighboring roof, he was among the volunteers who climbed ladders with wet blankets, his back and arms becoming part of the solution rather than calling upon powers beyond their reach. Even the boy who had once rejected all assistance appeared in the bucket line, his small hands steady as he passed water forward, no longer afraid of help that came in human form and asked nothing more than shared effort. The Guild of Gentle Helpers worked without needing to announce themselves, each person choosing their part in the larger rhythm of collective care. The fire was contained before dawn, not through magical efficiency, but through the patient cooperation of neighbors who had learned to work together when it mattered most. Standing in the aftermath, faces streaked with soot but bright with shared accomplishment, Kieran understood that some victories could only be earned through showing up as themselves, rather than as sources of supernatural solutions. Walking home. Through air that still carried traces of smoke, but also the promise of rain, Eleanor's soot-stained fingers intertwining with his, Kieran felt the hum in his chest settle into perfect harmony with his heartbeat. The night had taught him that the most powerful help sometimes looked like trust, sounded like, "We can do this together," and felt like the radical choice to offer his own imperfect, gloriously human presence to problems that communities could solve through their own patient strength. The fire's lessons had settled into the village like morning settling into stone, and with them came a transformation so gradual it felt like watching seasons change, barely noticeable day by day, yet profound when seen from the distance of weeks. Kieran woke with smoke still threaded through his hair and a quiet certainty in his chest that felt different from anything he had known before. The hum behind his ribs, once a ceaseless pull toward every need that called, now pulsed with the measured rhythm of a well-tuned cello, still responsive to the world's deeper currents, but with a nuanced understanding that allowed him to distinguish between genuine crisis and the necessary friction that helped hearts grow stronger. In the days that followed, he practiced what Elena began calling the art of stepping back, choosing absence as carefully as he had once chosen intervention. When the festival banner tore in a sudden gust of wind, Kieran felt the familiar urge to whisper help into the fair, but the 3 soft breaths Henrik had taught him revealed something beautiful. Tommy Brennan and Sarah were already climbing ladders with twine and good humor, their movements confident with hard-won competence. The boy who had once flinched from magical assistance passed up rope with steady hands, no longer afraid of help that came in human form, and asked nothing more than shared effort. Kieran found himself needed in a different way entirely, not as the one who could solve everything, but as someone whose presence anchored others while they discovered their own capabilities. When Mrs. Gable's roof began leaking during the season's first heavy rains, neighbors appeared with tools and knowledge passed down through generations of practical wisdom. Kieran worked among them not as their magical solution, but as one more, pair of hands holding steady, while others measured, hammered, and sealed. The Guild of Gentle Helpers evolved naturally into something deeper than their original vision. Their gatherings in the lighthouse lamp room took on the quality of shared prayer, each person bringing stories of moments when they had chosen human cooperation over supernatural shortcuts. Mira, now 15, and possessed of insights that sometimes surprised even Eleanor, articulated what they were all beginning to understand. We're learning to be the help we need, instead of always looking for it from somewhere else. They began marking their calendars with what Elena called rest days, afternoons when no one would summon assistance of any kind. Instead, they walked the shore, tended small repairs by hand, or sat with someone who needed company more than solutions. On those days, Kieran taught the practice of incomplete tasks, leaving a corner unpainted for a day, a note unwritten for an hour, allowing some struggles to ripen before rushing to resolve them. "A mercy hole for your to-do list," he would say with a smile that carried Henrik's old calm. And people laughed, then sighed, then started to sleep a little easier. His Meeseeks came rarely now, and when they did, they arrived with purpose that matched the true weight of emergency. A fisherman injured on slick timbers, a storm-torn roof that threatened real danger. Those visits felt like bells rung for prayer rather than alarms, each helper appearing with focused efficiency before bowing in the completion ceremonies they had learned and dissolving like satisfied waves returning to the sea. The villagers no longer called him the one who fixes everything. Instead, they knew him as Kieran of the quiet hands, or the keeper of gentle boundaries. His gift had found its proper proportion, not the answer to every problem, but one voice in a chorus of care that had learned to harmonize. When people came to him now, they sought not instant solutions but his patient listening, the way he would sit with their struggles, turning them over like smooth stones before gently guiding them toward their own inner resources. Walking the shore where Henrik had first taught him to read different kinds of calls, Kieran felt the understanding settle into his bones, like tide finding its proper level. The world's needs would always flow like an endless river, carrying countless invitations for intervention and assistance. But now he stood with both feet firmly planted on solid ground, able to choose his responses not from compulsion, but from the deeper wisdom of someone who had learned that even infinite compassion required the grace of boundaries. At night, as the lighthouse beacon swept its patient circle across dark water, Kieran would sit by the window with the keeper's log open to pages he might or might not fill. Some evenings he wrote only a line, "Today we chose the long way," and closed the book, like tucking the village in. Other nights he left the page blank, the way Henrik had asked, letting the wind write in its own quiet language. The hum in his chest had become something beautiful and sustainable, no longer the urgent demand of endless hunting, but the steady presence of someone who had learned to swim in deep water, who could feel every current without being swept away by all of them. This was the shore his gift had been seeking all along, a place where help flowed like tide, guided by boundaries tender enough to protect and strong enough to last, where people learned to be their own light and to rest, unashamed, in the gentle darkness between the beacon's patient sweeps. The understanding that communities could solve their own problems through patient cooperation had settled into Kieran's bones, like winter settling into stone. But winter that year brought more than the usual lessons about rest and renewal. It arrived carrying a persistent cough that seemed to echo in his chest alongside the familiar hum. And with it came a fatigue that made the lighthouse stairs feel like mountains requiring careful navigation. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had spent decades learning to distinguish between different kinds of calls now found his own body, whispering needs he had never learned to hear. Elena noticed first, as she noticed everything that mattered to their shared rhythm. "You're holding yourself differently," she observed one morning when he paused longer than usual over his tea, his weathered fingers wrapped around the cup as if drawing warmth from more than just the liquid within. There was no alarm in her voice, only the gentle recognition of someone who had spent years learning to read the subtle changes that marked life's natural progressions. The fever, when it finally announced itself clearly, felt like a foreign language. His body was trying to teach him. For someone who had spent his life attuned to others' distress, being the source of concern rather than its solution created a disorientation that went deeper than physical discomfort. When Mira appeared with broth prepared exactly as he liked it, his first instinct was to deflect, to minimize, to turn attention toward someone else's needs. The role of receiver felt like wearing clothes cut for someone else's body. Practice. Saying thank you as if you mean it, Eleanor reminded him with a smile that carried both love and gentle insistence, echoing words she had learned from him years before. Practice letting it matter. She tucked blankets around him with the same patient attention she brought to shaping dough, trusting processes that unfolded in their own time. The Guild of Gentle Helpers moved through the lighthouse with quiet purpose, embodying every lesson he had taught them about offering assistance without overwhelming. Mrs. Adelaide brought cool cloths that smelled faintly of lavender, her touch carrying the authority of someone who had learned to befriend her. Own vulnerabilities. Tommy Brennan fetched water from the well, his movements deliberate and respectful, never hovering but always present when needed. What surprised Kieran most was how his own teachings returned to him like tide finding familiar shores. The 3 soft breaths Henrik had taught him now became a way to accept, rather than evaluate, help. The mercy holes they had practiced in daily tasks created space for him to receive imperfectly, without shame. Even his helpers, when they appeared in response to genuine need, carried a different quality, not eager efficiency, but gentle reverence, as if they understood they were tending the one who had taught them about completion and rest. In the quiet, surrender that came with fever breaking, Kieran felt the hum in his chest settle into a new harmony. The circle of care he had spent years cultivating had completed itself, flowing back to him with the same patience and wisdom he had tried to offer others. Walking slowly to the window, where the beacon painted its patient sweep across dark water, he understood that even lighthouses needed tending, and that the deepest strength often lay not in standing alone, but in allowing oneself to be held by the same gentle hands one had spent a lifetime extending to the world. The lessons of receiving care had settled into Kieran's understanding, like morning settling into stone, and as his strength slowly returned, through the patient weeks of recovery, something beautiful and unexpected began to bloom in the spaces between his breaths. The hum behind his ribs, once urgent as storm waves, now pulsed with the gentle rhythm of tide pools filling at their own pace. When the helpers appeared now, and they came rarely like honored guests rather than eager servants, they moved with a reverence that spoke of deep transformation. On a morning when frost painted fern patterns across the lighthouse glass, the familiar blue shimmer bloomed near his bedside, but everything about its presence felt different. The Meeseeks materialized, and instead of announcing purpose with cheerful efficiency, placed one translucent hand over its own chest and breathed. In harmony with him, an unspoken question in the tilt of its head. May we? When he nodded, the helper's assistance came like whispered prayer. It warmed tea between blue palms before setting the cup within easy reach, lifted the corner of his blanket where it had bunched at his knees with such tenderness it felt like a lullaby sung without sound. Another appeared to open the window, just enough to let salt air slip in, then stood quietly as if guarding the threshold between weather and rest. "They've learned what you taught them," Elena observed from the doorway, her flour-dusted apron speaking of morning bread already rising in the bakery below. Not just about completion, but about love. The helper looked up at her words, its bright form flickering with what looked remarkably like gratitude before it bowed and dissolved like mist returning to the sea. These visits became occasions of mutual tending. In the lamproom where Henrik's great lens threw softened light across weathered walls, helpers would appear not to work, but simply to exist, their blue glow dimming to gentle warmth as they practiced the revolutionary art of being rather than doing. One evening, when a persistent cough returned like an unwelcome guest, a Meeseeks brought steam perfumed with mint and lemon, then counted breaths with him the way Mira had done when she was small, 3 fingertip beats on his wrist. "Here, here, here. What happens when there's nothing left to fix?" one whispered again. But this time the question carried wonder instead of panic. "You keep me company," Kieran answered, surprised by how simple and immense the truth felt. "And I let you." Mira, now grown into her own quiet authority, understood what was unfolding before anyone else. "They're not just your helpers anymore," she said, her worn rabbit catching lamplight like small prayers made visible. "They're learning to help themselves, learning what it means to rest without purpose, to exist without urgency." The transformation rippled beyond the lighthouse walls. The Guild of Gentle Helpers had evolved into something deeper than their original vision, a community that understood the sacred balance between offering and receiving. When genuine emergencies still called, the helpers appeared with focused efficiency, but their assistance now carried the wisdom of beings who had learned both action and stillness, who understood that even magical care could grow into something closer to friendship when allowed to rest to receive, and to discover its own need for the gentle grace of being truly seen. Walking slowly through the village during his first ventures beyond the lighthouse, Kieran felt the hum in his chest resonate with a world that had learned to carry itself with greater tenderness. The endless hunt had become something else entirely. Not the compulsion to fix everything, but the wisdom to know when help was complete, when rest was love, and when the greatest magic was simply learning to be present with whatever the moment offered, soft and patient as lighthouse beams, painting silver paths across dark water. The transformation of his helpers into companions had settled into Kieran's understanding like morning settling into stone, and as his strength returned through the patient weeks of recovery, he began to recognize what had been growing in the spaces between his breaths all along. The endless hunt, he realized, had never been about finding every problem to solve. It had been about learning to live peacefully with the world's perpetual needs while maintaining his own quiet center. Walking slowly through the village during those first ventures beyond the lighthouse, his steps still careful but growing stronger with each day, Kieran felt the hum in his chest resonate with a different quality entirely. It no longer tugged like a command, demanding immediate response to every dropped worry or minor frustration. Instead, it had become a gentle current that helped him recognize what truly deserved his attention and what could be left to others, to time, or to the natural resilience that lived beneath every struggle. He tried an experiment that morning, standing on the shore where Henrik had first taught him to read different kinds of calls. Instead of reaching toward every need that brushed his awareness, he practiced naming them like clouds drifting across an endless sky. Stubborn jar lid, loneliness after breakfast, lost button, worry about tomorrow's weather. He greeted each, softly, and let most drift past, touching only the ones whose weight settled with honest gravity in his chest. At a bend in the coastal path, he found Mr. Torres kneeling beside a fallen gull, its wing bent at an angle that spoke of endings rather than healings. Kieran knelt too, and together they breathed until the bird's trembling slowed. No blue shimmer came, no miracle was attempted. When the small chest finally quieted, they carried it to the dune grass and covered it with kelp like a blanket, and grief felt exactly the right size to hold between two people who understood that some things asked only for witness. "It isn't hunting anymore," he told Elena later, helping fold warm towels in the bakery's back room. "It's listening for the moments that want me, not the ones that only want finishing." She smiled in that way she had, as if approval were another kind of bread baked fresh each morning. "Then you are finally at home in your gift," she said, "home enough to step out for air when you need it." The Guild of Gentle Helpers had evolved into something deeper than their original vision, a network of individuals who understood that the world's pain was not a burden to be carried by one person, but a river that required many hands to guide its flow. They had learned to share the weight, to take turns listening to the world's quiet desperation, to offer each other the same patient care they extended to their neighbors. What had once been Kieran's solitary burden had become their collective wisdom. That understanding was tested when genuine emergency called. A child fallen from the apple tree behind the schoolhouse, her leg bent at an angle that made the adults' voices sharp with controlled panic. Kieran felt the familiar pull in his chest, but it came without the desperate urgency that had once consumed him. He summoned help with the same calm authority he brought to breathing, and the Meeseeks that appeared moved with focused efficiency, tempered by years of learned wisdom. They stabilized the child with gentle precision, created a stretcher from nearby branches, and worked in perfect harmony with the human hands that offered comfort and carried the girl toward the village healer. When their task was complete, the helpers didn't linger or seek additional purpose. They bowed with the reverence they had learned, dissolved like morning mist, and left behind only the quiet satisfaction of work truly finished. Walking home through air that carried salt and the promise of evening, Elena's hand warm in his, Kieran felt the understanding settle into his bones like tide, finding its proper level. The curse had become a gift, not through dramatic transformation, but through the patient recognition that the world was not a broken thing waiting for him to mend it. It was a living, breathing entity, constantly shifting and changing, and his role was not to control its currents, but to understand them, to offer light when darkness called for guidance, and to trust the natural rhythms that carried everything toward its own form of healing. The endless hunt had found its proper shore at last, not in the frantic pursuit of every need, but in the quiet practice of choosing his responses with the same care a lighthouse keeper brought to tending his beacon. Some nights the light would shine on genuine danger and guide ships safely home. Other nights it would simply sweep across calm water, a steady presence that asked nothing but offered everything to anyone who needed to remember they were not alone in the darkness between one sweep and the next. The understanding that his gift had found its proper rhythm settled into Kieran's bones, like winter settling into stone. But this was winter that carried peace rather than urgency. His hair had silvered like moonlight on still water, and his steps, though deliberate, moved with the gentle grace of someone who had learned to appreciate each moment, rather than rush toward the next task. The hum in his chest, which had once pulsed with urgent demand, now beat with the soft cadence of a lullaby that knew its own ending was approaching. On mornings when fog wrapped the village like a grey shawl, Kieran would sit by the lamproom window and practice what Elena called the gentle dissolve, letting his awareness rest without reaching toward every whisper of distress that touched his consciousness. The calls still came, but they felt different, now like letters addressed to someone he had been, but was no longer required to be. His gift had transformed from hunting to singing, a gentle current that connected him to the world's rhythms without demanding constant response. His helpers appeared rarely in those final seasons, and when they did, they moved with the reverence of old friends visiting during sacred hours. One evening, when the familiar blue shimmer bloomed near his bedside, the Meeseeks that materialized didn't announce itself with cheerful purpose. Instead, it settled beside his chair like a faithful companion content to share silence, its bright form dimming to the gentlest glow. "What comes after helping?" it asked in a voice like wind chimes, settling into stillness. "Rest," Kieran answered, surprised by how simple and complete the truth felt, the kind that doesn't wait for everything to be finished first. They sat together while the beacon painted its patient circle across dark water, two tired helpers, learning that completion could be gentle rather than urgent. When the helper finally dissolved, it wasn't with the usual pop of dismissal, but like morning mist returning to the sea, leaving behind only the faintest scent of rain and deep contentment. Elena, whose steady presence had become as essential as breathing, noticed how peace had settled into his shoulders like a well-worn coat. "You're not carrying the world anymore," she observed one afternoon as they folded clean linens with unhurried attention. "You're just holding your part of it gently." Mira, now grown into her own quiet authority, understood what was unfolding before anyone else. "The hum is changing," she said during one of their evening conversations, her worn rabbit catching lamplight like small prayers made visible. "That's not calling anymore, it's just humming." And it was true. The sensation that had once pulled him toward every need had transformed into something closer to music, a gentle current that flowed with the world's deeper rhythms without demanding he conduct the entire symphony. He could feel the village's needs like distant tide, but they no longer felt like urgent letters requiring immediate attention. They were part of a larger song that included rest notes, spaces where silence held as much meaning as sound. Walking slowly through the village during those precious final days, Kieran felt understanding bloom in his chest, like flowers that had been waiting decades to open. The endless hunt had never been endless at all. It had been preparing him for this moment of gentle completion, when he could finally trust that the world would continue its patient work of healing, even as his own particular way of helping settled into the quieter rhythms of blessing and memory. Soft as lighthouse beams, painting silver paths across water that held both darkness and reflected stars. The understanding that his gift had found its proper rhythm settled into Kieran's bones, like morning settling into stone, and as spring painted the village in shades of gentle possibility. He felt the hum in his chest begin its final transformation. It no longer pulsed with urgent demand or even patient response, but had become something closer to music, a quiet harmony that flowed with the world's deeper currents without requiring him to conduct the symphony. On mornings when fog lifted, like a curtain being drawn back from the world's stage, Kieran would sit by the lighthouse window and practice what had become his most important skill, the art of gentle completion. He moved through small preparations with unhurried attention, placing Henrik's brass key beside the keeper's log, setting the merchant's riverstone on the windowsill where it could continue watching tides it had always understood, arranging his few belongings like someone writing thank-you notes to a life well lived. The Guild of Gentle Helpers had grown into something beautiful and self-sustaining, no longer needing his guidance to navigate the difference between helping and healing. Mrs. Chen's laughter had returned, shaken free by stories and shared tasks. Tommy Brennan taught younger children to take 3 soft breaths before asking for assistance, as if patience were a lantern anyone could learn to carry. The boy who had once refused all help now brought kindling to the lighthouse with the quiet diligence of someone who had learned that receiving care could be its own form of strength. When his final helper appeared on what would be their last afternoon together, it came not in response to any call, but as if drawn by the same mysterious current that brings birds home at evening. The blue shimmer bloomed near his chair like recognition made visible, and the Meeseeks that materialized moved with the reverence of someone approaching sacred ground. "I wanted to sit with you," it said simply, settling beside him like an old friend content to share silence. They rested together while the village carried on its patient work of being itself, children playing in the square, Elena kneading tomorrow's bread, Mira tending the garden with the old tin watering can he had passed to her that morning. "What comes after helping?" the helper asked eventually, its voice carrying wonder instead of the old urgency. "Rest," Kieran answered, surprised by how complete the truth felt. The kind that doesn't wait for everything to be finished first. The kind that knows love continues even when our particular way of loving changes form. When evening painted the lighthouse in shades of amber and gold, Elena found him by the window where the beacon's sweep had begun to synchronize with his breathing. "You look like someone who has found what he was searching for," she said, settling beside him with tea that steamed like visible prayers. "I think I was never searching," he replied, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had learned to read the deepest currents. "I think I was just learning to be still enough to recognize what was already here, that the world holds itself with such tenderness, and we're invited to be part of that holding, not to carry it all alone." Mira joined them as the golden hour deepened, her presence as steady as the lighthouse beam that had guided them all. When Kieran's breathing began to match the rhythm of waves against stone, she took one of his hands while Elena held the other, and together they anchored him while he prepared for his own gentle dissolve. The hum that had lived behind his ribs for so many decades didn't disappear but seemed to settle into the very air of the lighthouse, becoming part of the rhythm that would continue to guide travelers safely home. His passing came as softly as his living had become, a quiet exhale during the moment when day and night pause to acknowledge each other, when lighthouse beams find their reflection in calm water. In the days that followed, people noticed something different about the beacon's sweep, not brighter or stronger, but carrying a quality that felt like blessing, like gentle hands reaching out not to fix or solve, but simply to say, "I see you. Your struggle matters. You are not alone." The Guild continued their work with the wisdom he had taught them, understanding now that the endless hunt had never been about one person carrying the world's weight, but about learning to share that, care so gracefully that everyone grew stronger. His legacy lived on in Elena's patient heart, in Mira's steady presence, in the village's learned wisdom about when to help and when to witness, when to act, and when to trust others' capacity to find their own light. And sometimes on quiet nights when the world's needs seem too heavy to bear, people say they can still feel it. The echo of gentle hands reaching through darkness, not with desperate urgency, but with the patient understanding that care, once given freely, becomes part of the world's own capacity for healing. And with that he stretched one final time into the vast gentleness of stars and dreams and all the quiet helpers who learned, through him, that the most revolutionary act is knowing when enough help is enough, when rest becomes its own form of love, and when the endless hunt finally finds its home in the simple practice of being present to whatever the moment offers. Soft as breath, patient as tide, eternal as the light that guides all travelers safely through the darkness toward morning. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.